Hi everyone, we're Enron 37. My name is Don Dane, and then the other three members are Farhan Molla, Harshil Patel, and Dhruv Japati. And today I'll be leading the presentation. Our project is called Manipulation of CAISO Congestion Rules. In this presentation, we're going to walk through 5 things: how we define wrongdoing, the strategy we used to find it in the Enron emails, how we implemented that strategy in code, the specific email evidence we ended up with, and then what we learned and what we'd fix next time. Overall, our claim is that Enron's West Power Desk wasn't just trading aggressively, it was systematically gaming CAISO's congestion rules. And you can actually see that pattern in the email archive if you're careful about how you search. To set the stage, this all happens during the California electricity crisis of 2000 to 2001. California had split its old vertically integrated utilities into power exchange for day-ahead trades and CAISO for real-time operations. In theory, that structure plus pricing formulas and out-of-market payments was supposed to produce efficient, transparent prices. But in practice, it created loopholes. If you understand the formulas and side payments well enough, you could manufacture congestion or schedule phantom flows and still get paid. Enron's West Power Desk became famous for exactly that kind of behavior, not just reacting to real bottlenecks, but actively creating artificial congestion and using CAISO's rules as a profit engine. On this slide, we're zooming in on our core research question. The main question we're asking is, can Enron's internal emails show that West Power Desk systematically gamed CAISO's congestion rules between 2000 and 2002? In other words, not just that they traded aggressively, but that they were consistently using CAISO's rules as something to exploit. To tackle that, our goal was to take our three-part definition of wrongdoing: intent and knowledge, facilitation mechanisms, and enforcement or financial consequences, and turn it into a transparent, repeatable search pipeline over the Enron email archive. Here's the big picture. The workflow looks like this. First, we use code to narrow the universe of emails down to the ones that are most likely about CAISO congestion and West Power. Then, from that filter set, we use closed reading to interpret a much smaller group of high-value messages that actually speak to CAISO rule gaming. On this slide, we're laying down out what we actually mean by wrongdoing. And we want to be very specific about this. So first, there has to be intent and knowledge. People inside Enron recognizing that CAISO and PX rules can be gamed or used in ways the designers didn't mean to intend. And secondly, that intent has to be facilitated through concrete mechanisms, things like congestion management, proxy MCP pricing, out-of-market payments, and scheduling patterns that create artificial flows rather than just reflecting real grid conditions. Third, we look for enforcement or consequences, emails that connect those tactics to money congestion, rents, mark-to-market gains, refunds, settlements, or attempts to avoid liability. And finally, we treat this as an institutional pattern, not one rogue trader. We're interested in repeated, coordinated behavior by the West Power Desk, supported by management and legal, not just a single bad email. For this slide, we're showing how we turned our three-part definition of wrongdoing into a pipeline the computer can actually run. First, we built the three handcrafted lexicons: one for intent and knowledge, one for the CAISO mechanisms that enable rule gaming, and one for enforcement or financial consequences. These lexicons make our definition operational. Anyone can open them, see exactly what terms we want, and counted, and debate or adjust the choices. Secondly, we applied Elasticsearch filters to keep our search inside the actual crisis context. We limit the time frame to 2000 to 2002, which requires CAISO or congestion-related data, which is the vocabulary that we focus on, the West Power actors, etc. This anchors the search to the people, institutions, and mechanics involved in the California's market failures instead of scanning the entire Enron archive blindly. Third, every filtered email gets a wrongdoing score from 0 to 3. Depending on whether it shows intent, mechanisms, and enforcement language, this gives us a consistent, transparent way to compare messages rather than cherry-picking which ones seem suspicious. Finally, we define a candidate set. Emails that contain intent plus at least one of the other two prongs. We take the top 15 candidates for close reading. And from that group, we evaluate the 8 core emails in our paper. So the biggest question is why? Why did we choose this strategy compared to other strategies that we could have adapted? So we explain why we use this particular pipeline instead of more complicated tools. First, our approach is transparent and fully auditable. So every term in each lexicon, every filter, and every scoring decision is visible. That means anyone in the class could reproduce our exact results or challenge our assumptions. Secondly, this method is directly tied to our wrongdoing definition. Because our framework is built around intent, mechanism, and enforcement, we needed a search process that could operationalize those three dimensions in a clear way. Third, the pipeline is reproducible. If someone else runs our script on the same Elasticsearch index, they get the same candidate emails. That's much harder to guarantee if we use machine learning or semantic models. We also deliberately avoided black box methods like clustering or large language model based semantic search. Those techniques might surface interesting patterns, but they're difficult to justify, difficult to interpret, and impossible to grade consistently. Finally, this pipeline helps us avoid cherry picking. Instead of selecting emails that look suspicious, we score every message the same way and then allow the top ranked candidates to drive our close reading. Overall, we chose this method because it best fits the assignment's goals: methodological clarity, interpretability, and a defensible link between our definition of wrongdoing and the evidence we present. This slide shows examples from our three dictionaries. On the intent side, we look for language like gaming the rules, playing the game, abusing the rules, or explicit market manipulation talk. For the mechanism lexicon, we focus on technical phrases tied to CAISO's design: price caps, proxy MCP, parking power, out of market, MD02, and congestion-specific terminology. And for this enforcement lexicon, we include terms like settlements, liability, subpoenas, exposure, FERC, and refunds. All of these terms live in simple text files, not hard-coded. That means another researcher could open our repo, see exactly what we counted as intent or mechanism, and argue with it or tweak it. We first narrowed the universe of emails. We restricted the time frame to 2000 to 2002, which covers the peak of the California crisis and the early enforcement period. We filtered for emails with clear CAISO or congestion vocabulary, so we stayed inside the California market context. And we focused on West Power actors, people like Tim Belden, Dave Perino, Susan Maria, Jeff Dazovich, Bob Badir, Mark Wally, and Steve Keen, who showed up repeatedly in investigations of Western trading. This step is important. It anchors our research in the right institutional setting instead of treating Enron as one big picture and a homogeneous blob. On this slide, we're showing how we turn raw email text into a simple wrongdoing score. First, for each email, we look into both the subject line and the body and check which terms from our three-dimensional dictionaries actually appear. Then we flip three flags, one for intent or knowledge, one for facilitation through CAISO mechanisms, and one for enforcement for financial consequences. Each flag is either true or false, depending on whether we see at least one term from that lexicon. We then add up those flags to get a wrongdoing score from 0 to 3. 0 means the email doesn't hit any of our dimensions. 3 means it simultaneously shows intent, a concrete mechanism, and some kind of legal or financial exposure. Finally, we define candidate wrongdoing emails as those that show intent plus at least one of the other two dimensions. That rule gives us a consistent way to narrow down thousands of messages down to a small high-value set for close reading. On this slide, the figure on the left shows the distribution of wrongdoing scores in our CAISO or West Power sample. You can see that the most of the email clusters are in the middle. They hit one or two dimensions, but very few hit all three. That's what we'd expect. Manipulation is often implied, not shouted. On the right, we show the top senders among high-scoring emails. Certain names pop up more often than the candidate's wrongdoing messages. This slide zooms in on the top 15 scoring emails. Here you can see our exported Excel file, where each row is an email with an ID, date, sender, subject, and then the flags for intent, facilitation, and enforcement. We use this spreadsheet as an audit trail. Instead of saying trust us, we picked 8 interesting emails. We can show exactly how each candidate scored and why it was selected. From this ranked list, we then pull 8 emails that best illustrate our 3-part definition, and that taken together tells us a coherent story about the CAISO rule gaming. Email 1 is called Material on PX Purchasing and Contracting for California Senate. What's happening here is that Enron staff are circulating detailed analysis of weak spots in California's market design. Things like rigid PX bidding rules, misalignment between forward and real-time markets, and fragile links between schedules and actual flows. The important part is that this isn't just background reading. These are the same structural issues Enron later exploited with congestion and overscheduling strategies. In the same chain, people prepping Steve Keen's Senate testimony explicitly ask, Was the market manipulated, and who were the participants? So this email strongly supports that the intent and knowledge prong. Enron wasn't stumbling into a broken market. It was actively mapping the cracks. Email 2 is CAISO MCP postings, forwarded by David Perino. Here, Perino pushes real-time market clearing price information directly to traders like Belden, Mara, and Williams. The body explains what these MCPs represent, including congestion charges, and why missing pieces of that information makes it harder for the real-time traders in the West to make the best business decisions possible. On its face, sending price data, it's normal. But when you place this in the context of strategies like Death Star and Ricochet, these granular MCP updates become inputs to gaming. They tell you exactly how CAISO's algorithm is reacting, so you can schedule around it. So email 2 is a key piece of facilitation. It shows the information pipeline that makes real-time manipulation possible. Email 3 is a forwarded article titled CAISO Cuts Refund Estimate to $6.1 billion from $8.9 billion. Jeff Dazovich passes this around internally, highlighting the fact that refund estimates are dropping but are still in the billions. Refunds estimates of this size only matter if you think you might be on the hook for overcharges. A completely clean participant might glance at this, but Enron is tracking it closely. The article also frames the estimate as a potential framework for settlement discussions, which signals that people inside Enron were thinking about how much of their crisis-era profits might get clawed back. So this email mainly supports the enforcement benefit dimension it shows. The awareness that their trading behaviors was directly connected to massive potential liability. Email 4 is CAISO Energy Brokers 2. This message distributes broker sheets, bid ranges, expected supply and demand imbalances, and real-time broker sentiment. These are forwarded directly to Belden. On paper, this looks like normal market intelligence, but for Enron's West Power Desk, this is exactly the kind of information that makes strategies like Ricochet work, exporting power out of California and re-importing it at higher prices under different categories. The sender even notes that these sheets will be useful for Belden, which is a polite way of saying this is operational feel for whatever you're planning. So again, the email doesn't say let's manipulate the market, but it clearly illustrates the informational infrastructure behind those manipulative strategies. Email 5 is correction of FERC June 19 market notice. But William forwards a CAISO notice that tweaks how price caps, penalties, and settlement rules are implemented. This level of attention to minor regulatory corrections tells us something important. Traders were not just watching prices, they were also watching how prices are computed. If your entire business model is to live on the edge of price caps and exploit proxy pricing rules, then tiny formula changes matter. That makes this email another strong example of facilitation plus enforcement. It shows how regulatory details feed directly into trading strategies and risk management. Email 6 is Attention, Electricity Oversight Board Further Subpoena Notice. This lands in a folder literally labeled ISO_price caps, and it warns recipients about new subpoenas targeting California electricity operations. The author notes that the confidential order appears to protect our commercial interests, and proposes a conference call with Enron lawyer Richard Sanders if there are concerns. That combination of subpoenas explicitly mentions of commercial interests and immediate plan for a legal huddle. It shows a defensive posture, so this email is squarely in the enforcement benefit bucket. It shows Enron understood that its CAISO strategies and price cap behaviors were under legal scrutiny and needed to be managed. Email 7 is Dazovich's summary. Judge's recommendation on retroactive refunds. He summarizes the chief judge's view that very large refunds would be due, probably in the hundreds of millions or over $1 billion, even if California's full $8.9 billion claim wasn't substantiated. The summary also gets very specific about the refund effective date, October 2nd, 2000, and limits it to the spot market sales of 24 hours or less. That level of detail matters. Enron is tracking exactly which trades in which time windows might be clawed back. So this email reinforces the idea that Enron wasn't just aware of political noise around the crisis, it was deeply engaged in how regulators and judges might retroactively reprice its revenue streams. Finally, email 8 is cost reduction measures, which attaches a letter from Southern California's Edison CEO, Stephen Frank, to Steve Keen. Frank explains that SCE has racked up more than $2 billion in costs, and it can't pass through because of the retail rate freeze. And he says explicitly that the California wholesale markets are not workably competitive. Sharing this internally signals that Enron's leadership understood both how broken the market was and how much damage that was going to do to the utilities and the consumers. Combined with the earlier emails, this undercuts the idea that Enron was just responding to neutral price signals. They knew the system was failing, partly because of the strategies like theirs, and they still treated it as a profit opportunity. So this is another strong piece of intent or knowledge story. On this slide, we're stepping back and talking about why these emails are actually useful evidence. First, the 8 emails we focus on are not good because they document every single manipulative trade Enron ever did. We're not claiming that. Instead, their value is that they give us a credible, internal, consistent snapshots of Enron's mindset around CAISO. If you read it together, they show a very clear intellectual awareness of CAISO's vulnerabilities, things like congestion formulas, price caps, proxy MCPs, and refund exposure, and how those design flaws could be turned into profit opportunities. The tone of the emails also matters. They're not panicked or casual one-offs. They read like deliberate, strategic thinking. People circulating design memos, price cap corrections, broker sheets, subpoena notices, and refund estimates as inputs together ongoing strategy, not as isolated events. We originally had a top 15 high scoring email from the code. From those, we chose these 8 emails because they do the best job of covering all 3 prongs of our wrongdoing definition. Some are especially strong on intent and knowledge of gaming opportunities. Some are strongest on facilitation mechanisms, the operational plumbing behind CAISO rule gaming. Other really highlights enforcement and financial consequences, refunds, subpoenas, and legal risk. We also wanted diversity, different senders, different moments in the crisis, and different parts of the pipeline, from high-level design analysis to the on-desk operational data to legal and refund fallout. The other 7 candidates tended to be either more repetitive versions of these themes, or they were mostly about one dimension like legal risk, without adding much new stuff about mechanisms or intent. So these 8 give us the cleanest, most balanced story while still staying tightly tied to our 3-part definition of wrongdoing. So what can be improved? At the same time, we're very aware of the limits of our own method. One big improvement would be to shift from content-only analysis to time-sensitive analysis. For example, tracking what traders do in the hour after they receive an MCP update or a broker sheet. We call this a reactionary window, automatically looking up for the follow-up emails that give instructions, change schedules, or move power right after a key informational email hit. Another improvement is linguistic. Instead of chasing colorful slang like Death Star, we should focus on even more technical euphemisms, terms like parking power or non-firm exports that are how manipulations actually show up in written communication. So what was unfixable? There are also some limitations with our approach. We can't just fix with better code. First, this is an email-only view of Enron. A lot of CAISO rule gaming happened on phone calls, in-person meetings, or inside trading, systems that don't leave a text trail. Second, traders self-censored. The more sensitive a strategy was, the less likely it was to be written down. Third, the dataset itself is incomplete. Some inboxes are missing, some attachments never made it into the archive, and finally, keyword-based text analysis is never going to perfectly capture implicit meaning or tone. At the end of the day, there's always a layer where a human reader has to decide whether a given email crosses the line from aggressive to abusive. To wrap up, I'll just highlight 3 biggest takeaways: what we found, what we built, and what's still missing. First, the substantive findings. Across these emails, Enron's West Power Desk is clearly treating CAISO's rules as a profit toolkit, not neutral plumbing. The focus isn't on physical fundamentals like fuel or weather. It's on price cap, congestion rents, MCP formulas, and refund exposure. That pattern matches exactly the kind of CAISO rule gaming percolator described. Secondly, the methodological contribution. We showed that a 3-part definition of wrongdoing, intent, mechanism, enforcement can be turned into code. Our lexicons plus the Elasticsearch filters give a transparent scoring pipeline where anyone can see which terms we use, change them, rerun the search, and compare the results. That keeps the analysis auditable instead of relying on a black box model. Finally, the limits and future work. Emails tell us who knew what and when, but not which specific trades were executed after each message. We see the information inputs, MCP updates, price cap corrections, subpoenas, but not the bids and schedules that were followed. With more time, the next step is to look at trustable sources online that support our wrongdoing, which may improve our code quality. Lastly but not least, here's our sources and references that we use in our paper and also our Google Slides. And also, this is our GitHub repository where you can see where we created all of our code changes. And we also created a README file that shows how you can actually run and boot it up yourself. And let's give a quick shout out to Dr. Borowitz and also the TA staffs for making this possible and answering my questions. Thank you so much.